Seems to be recording. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. We've got at least a couple dozen people already signed on, which is really terrific. I want to welcome everybody back to this second talk in our webinar series this year. We had really nice turnout for our January call, and already great turnout for today. And just a reminder to everybody that the webinars are all being recorded, and so they'll all be available later on throughout the year on the APA Division 34 YouTube page. So you can check them out anytime if you want to go back to something that you hear today. I have one quick announcement before we get started with today's call, which is that if you are a Division 34 member and have not been receiving any messages from the Division 34 listservs over the past couple of weeks since the end of January, please send me a quick note to let me know. I know that APA has been having some trouble, but they're not sure how widespread the problem has been, and so I'm trying to help them get a sense. But I know there are at least a few of us that have not been getting listserv emails. So if you've been having if you just haven't gotten anything, you should have. So please let me know. And with that, I think we'll get started. So I'm really excited today to introduce our next speaker in the 2020 webinar series, Dr. Sonya Sachdeva. And Sonya is a research social scientist with the US Forest Service who uses both computational and psychological tools to understand the role of sociocultural factors in shaping environmental thought and behavior. She's part of actually only one of very few Forest Service research work units that study the human component of natural resource management within urban ecosystems. Scientists in her unit conduct research on a wide array of topics, including the impact of climate change on conservation decision-making, understanding perceptions of air and water pollution, and addressing environmental justice issues in urban environments. Sonya is also an adjunct, has an adjunct appointment with the Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern University, where she did her PhD in cognitive psychology. She also holds a bachelor's in economics from the University of Michigan. And so you can already get a sense that she has quite a diverse, multidisciplinary background. She's published widely in all sorts of top journals, including Psychological Science, The American Psychologist, and Cognition. And her work has been featured in a variety of popular media outlets, including Wired, Science Friday, and the Washington Post. At the moment, some of her projects include a large-scale automated text analysis of wildfire coverage in the media, field assessments of the efficacy of environmental programs, and behavioral experiments to study the impact of resource scarcity on conservation behavior. And today she'll be talking with all of us about the use of multi-method approaches to conducting use-inspired environmental research. So I'm really excited that Sonya was able to join us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And I think Sonya will be sharing some slides with us as she talks.
Thanks, Ezra. Do I need to just start sharing my screen?
Just share it, yep.
Is that the right orientation? Yeah, okay.
Good.
Well, thank you so much. I think Ezra and others came up with this webinar initiative this year, and it's just a wonderful idea. So I'm so honored to be the second presenter in this series. As Ezra mentioned, I come from a really heavily psychological background, but because I've been with the Forest Service for the past 5 years or so, I've had the privilege of being exposed to so many different perspectives, and also really focus on this idea of use-inspired research. And so with that perspective, I want to share with you some of the great examples I have seen of multi-methods research and how it could be really applied to the world, and also share with you some of the examples from my own work. So just to lay the stage a bit, I think, since the inception of the field, right now might actually be the best time for us as environmental psychologists, because of all of these hugely complex environmental challenges that we're facing in the world right now. Environmental psychologists have the potential to create some really profound change in the world. And that's and probably more so than any other psychological discipline. So, you know, we as psychologists understand that climate change is really, it's a commons dilemma, but on a huge geographic scope and multi-generational scope. We understand that deforestation is happening across the globe, but, you know, we as humans might not have, our inclination might not be to understand the global scope of these things. And of course, natural disasters, so much of the work that we've seen in moral psychology really comes down to how much our moral circle can actually understand who is being impacted by these natural disasters. And of course, you know, with climate change, there's so many social precursors, and the impacts of deforestation and natural disasters are huge. So all of that together makes this the right time to have a really theory-driven, empirical approach to understanding how humans conceptualize and relate to the natural world. And, you know, because of this scope and scale of environmental psychology, we have always employed many different types of research approaches. Our field is really unique in its emphasis on place-based cognition and behavior. So this understanding that how we think and how we act is really defined and constrained by the built and natural world around us. And, you know, of course, that has an impact on how we think and how we act. And that really positions us nicely to tackle many of the wide-ranging environmental challenges around us. What that also means is that for us as environmental psychologists, lab-based experiments, which have been the gold standard across all of psychology, shouldn't be our gold standard, right? Because those lab-based experiments usually are designed to be fairly acontextual, and as environmental psychologists, we know that that's not really relevant for how people think and behave. Luckily, there are a wide variety of psychological tools that we can select from. You know, so studies looking at focus groups, observational data, case studies, but then also surveys, experiments, as I alluded to, and also recently neuroimaging techniques, and also, you know, using things like EEGs or eye tracking. For many of our common methodologies, you know, we have seen issues. So, you know, there are problems with self-reported data, and there are several biases that we need to be mindful of with experiments. But it's also worth noting that this kind of spectrum or delineation between qualitative data on one side, so all of the focus groups and case studies, versus the surveys and experiments, that kind of distinction between qualitative data and quantitative data may no longer be sufficiently descriptive or even useful when it comes to the type of work that we do more and more of in environmental psychology. So for example, and we'll get into this a bit more, you know, the type of work that I do, which is the large scale content analyses of, you know, text of various kind, is that qualitative? Is that quantitative? You know, like it is analyzing qualitative data, but taking a very quantitative approach to do that. And this kind of uneasiness with the qualitative quantitative distinction has been verbalized really nicely in a paper by Bennett et al. In 2017, which came out in Biological Conservation. And they showed that it was actually, what was really nice about this paper was that they had like 15 different co-authors from all sorts of different social science backgrounds. And they noted that, you know, the data that's most useful for environmental social science goes beyond just qualitative and quantitative. So we have really cool, and even within the Forest Service, we have this really cool unit doing what's known as strategic foresight. And I like to jokingly think of them as the Oracle, because all they do is sit in a room and think of these scenarios that are likely to occur in the future based on current circumstances, and how can we plan for those. So that foresight planning idea doesn't really fall neatly into the qualitative quantitative distinction Similarly, with spatial analyses, a lot of people within the Forest Service use GIS, and it's so important for environmental psychology because of that place-based idea that we have within the field. And of course, meta-analyses are of crucial importance in terms of synthesizing and integrating all of the literature that we have accumulated across the various disciplines within the environmental social sciences. And what's worth noting is that the technological advances that we've seen, particularly in the last decade or so, have made using a diverse array of methodologies easier than ever. And you know, some of these listed here are new because of the technological revolution and advances in computing power. But others are just improvements, right? So we have better algorithms to do things that we've been doing forever. For one thing, crowdsourcing platforms like MTurk have made doing online studies with huge sample sizes easier than ever. You know, studies with using ecological momentary assessment where researchers might text you or ask you to respond back as you're experiencing a particular intervention. Those are cheaper now, right? So like, because everybody has a smartphone, you don't necessarily need to give people a monitor or something to collect that sort of data. With content analyses, you know, I work with data sets of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even, you know, millions when it comes to tweets. And it's much easier to do that now using some of the automated techniques, you know, although they may have problems compared to human coding techniques. But it makes it much easier to do with the computing power that we have now. Finally, things like machine learning have made classification and categorization much easier. So, you know, using neural nets like TensorFlow to analyze vast quantities of images, or in some of our work, we've used support vector machines to classify, okay, this is an example of liberal speech patterns. This is an example of conservative speech patterns. So all those kinds of classification applications have been made much easier with advances in machine learning. And then one other methodology that I want to briefly talk about, because I just think it's so cool, is this idea of using virtual or augmented reality to study cognition. And, you know, it would have been inaccessible to the vast majority of us just maybe even 5 years ago. But now with headsets that are fairly cheap and accessible, more and more researchers are doing this. And as one example of this, one of my co-authors, Matthew Browning, he led a really cool study on what are the impacts of simulated nature, experiencing nature within a virtual environment, rather than actually being outdoors in nature. Do they have the same effects, or you know, is only being actually outdoors in nature and hearing all the sounds and feeling the wind on your face, is that what leads to all of nature's restorative effects on mental health and physiology and all of those kinds of things? And they did a really cool experiment in which they exposed participants either to a real outdoor environment, you know, told them to spend 10 minutes outside, versus a virtual outdoor session where they're still sitting in a lab, but they just have, you know, like an Oculus headset, and they're experiencing a 360-degree immersion in virtual nature. And I mean, it was stunning to me to see these results that actually the virtual outdoors had pretty similar physiological effects, and this is skin conductance here on the y-axis, as being outside, as being really outside. And that's pretty amazing because, you know, while we probably don't want to make the claim that kids can just be allowed to play indoors with headsets on, think about what this means for people with limited mobility, right? So we kind of get a sense of, you know, if you don't have as much mobility as you used to and are not able to go get outside as much as you used to, a 10-minute dose within a virtual environment may give you a lot of the same types of positive effects of being outside in nature. And finally, I want to talk about something that I have really played around with quite a bit, which is social media. So this is one that I'll go into a little bit more detail just because it's the one that I have quite a bit of experience with. And so, you know, for most of you, it's not going to be a surprise to learn that the amount of data that we're generating as humans is like just, it boggles the mind. I mean, it's basically something that we can't even begin to conceptualize. You can read these stats on your own, but basically in every single minute, Americans are using 4 million gigabytes of internet data to do various things. I remember giving a version of this talk, you know, like 4 or 5 years ago, and that global data supply wasn't anywhere near what it is now. So this is exponentially increasing. It's also worth noting that this is not just a phenomenon that's isolated to the US, but, you know, over 50% of the world, so 1 in 2 humans on the planet is now online, and 1 in 3 are on social media. And in fact, in many countries, being on social media is actually synonymous with being online. So if you're on the internet, you are certainly making use of platforms such as Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram, which are all owned by the same company. And considering all of that, it's worth asking, is any of this data useful? And in my mind, that's a really fair question, right? Because so much of what we see on social media these days just seems to be, you know, like a meme generation machine, or like, you know, just making trolling really easy. But, you know, actually researchers have shown that this data can be really useful for gleaning some valuable psychological insights. There's a possibility to conduct longitudinal analyses, cultural studies, and really some people have actually even started to call it, social media data has the potential of creating a mass ethnography of all of humankind. And you know, on the really fundamental level, this is the new reality, right? So many people experience the world through the filter of social media, and also that's the way that a lot of people are receiving information. So yes, I believe that this sort of data is actually very useful, and in fact, where one of the areas in which it's shown to be very, very applicable is this entire new field that's been developed in the past decade called crisis informatics. And this field refers to the idea of using social media during, before and after natural disasters, and you know, before it can help in predicting where hurricanes are going to fall, or some research has shown that actually social media is better predictive of earthquakes than even like USGS's actual sensors. It is a much more fine-grained momentary assessment of that. Afterwards, social media can be used to figure out where are the places where people need the most help and what kind of help they need. And in some of our own work, we've shown that social media can actually be an accurate predictor of air quality impacts during and after wildfires. So all of that has resulted in this pretty robust field of crisis informatics, which suggests that social media can be very useful during and in dealing with natural disasters. And even in psychology, there have been some really cool studies coming out. So for instance, in psych science, I believe a number of years ago now, they were able to use the content of people's tweets to figure out or to predict a heart attack risk. So, you know, tweets that had a lot of negative sentiment and even tweets that used more profanity, that corresponded with an increased prevalence of cardiovascular incidents in a particular census tract, I believe is what they were using for their geographic analysis. So, you know, within psychology, I think it's still in its very early days, but social media does have the potential to tell us how people are thinking, and specifically give us real-time information that it's still pretty difficult for us to get. In some of our work that we're doing within the Forest Service and in partnership with a lot of other land management agencies, we're finding that social media can be used to estimate how many people are recreating on our public lands. And you know, we've developed methodologies like survey-based and counter-based methodologies to do that. But social media is kind of a complementary and perhaps a low-cost way of measuring use on public lands. And again, it gives you that finer grain notion or idea of where use is higher at a given moment in time than counters or surveys can do. Furthermore, we're also finding that the semantic content, as I noted, you know, like the content of the tweets or the content of the Instagram post, can provide really useful psychological data. So a recent study found that people who spend time in nature, so as they're spending that time in urban parks, the study had it, they get a happiness boost, which those authors related to, you know, Christmas. So they found that an equivalent happiness boost happens while people are spending time in parks as happens on Christmas Day, which was pretty amazing. But as with any new methodological approach, there are a number of factors that we need to be cautious about. So one point that always gets raised when I talk about social media data as a whole is, well, how representative is this data, right? You know, are we capturing people who are not online? Are those people different than the people who are online? Another issue with representativeness is which platform. So one thing that's really interesting, and I think Pew has done this research, is that if you look at the demographics of the various platforms, so comparing Facebook with Twitter, with Instagram, with Reddit, you'll see slightly different demographic profiles across each of these platforms. And that's important to know. And it's also important for researchers to go to all of these different platforms and collect data, because you're most likely not getting the same data across the platforms. But one thing I will say about this, though, is that the use of social media data has made it possible to reach populations that actually we wouldn't have had access to before. As I mentioned, you know, 30% of the world is using social media data, and that's a lot more than what our traditional approaches in psychology have been reaching, globally speaking. Secondly, the larger scale nature of social media data might require non-standard statistical approaches. So approaches that we've always used in lab-based psych experiments may not necessarily be useful when we're looking at social media data, which gets into the tens of millions of responses. And so the acceptance of exploratory analyses is, and realizing that it's not going to always take a clean hypothesis testing framework is important. And then finally, this idea of ethics and privacy is huge in our culture right now, and it also needs to be acknowledged and identified, and researchers need to be mindful of this as they're using social media data for their research. You know, it took psychology a long time to get to this idea of informed consent. It was a painful process, but I think we would all agree that it's a very necessary process that we had to, or necessary objective that we all had to reach. And something similar needs to be done with social media data. You know, we need to come up with those types of standards, which corporations who are already using all of that data are not going to be as concerned with. So, you know, by bringing in reasonably impartial researchers who can develop a strict code of conduct, that's going to help us in protecting participant privacy, but also giving a clearer sense of what is the conversation happening in social media? Because so much of the time, the way that we experience social media is it's kind of insulated. It seems like we have access to all of Twitter, but really we're going to see people within our social networks more often, and that does create a kind of echo chamber. And so, you know, having these large scale analyses of Twitter as a whole, or a topic as a whole within social media, is important to give us a sense of what the conversation actually is. Okay, so, you know, so far I've just been talking about all of these methodological innovations, so new types of paradigms that have been developed. But now I want to get into why the combination of those methodologies is really important. So many of you, all of you, are probably aware of the replication crisis in the sciences. You know, depending on which estimate you look at, 30 to 70% of effects across, it's not just psychology, across medicine, biology, cancer research, pharmaceutical research, cannot be reproduced. I mean, it's scary to think about that. And what a lot of researchers and philosophers of science are now saying is that direct or straight replications may not be as useful as triangulation, which is the idea of using different methodologies, each with their own biases, to address a central question. So, you know, each methodology, as we've talked about, social media or virtual reality or classification techniques, each of these different methodologies have their own biases built in, right? So there's no methodology that's perfect, but by using distinct methodologies, we can address the shortcomings of each, or cancel out the shortcomings of any particular approach. And you know, the results that you get from using a combination of different methodologies may be less likely to contain statistical artifacts than just using one type of methodology, let's say lab-based experiments over and over again, which will actually compound those statistical artifacts. Triangulation can also be a means of inferring causal relationships without relying simply on experimental design, which is, you know, really necessary for us as psychologists, and helping us gain kind of externally valid results. So one thing that I wanted to mention, and I love the way that this particular cancer researcher put it, is that what our fields need now are, rather than us building grand mansions of straw, we need sturdy houses of brick. And the way that I like to think of this from the psychological perspective, you know, grand mansions of straw might be papers with 7 experiments all in a row, looking at, you know, very limited or a narrow question, and finding tiny switches that maybe turn that effect partially on or off. And what a sturdy house of bricks might look like is just maybe 1, 2 studies, but showing a really tangible effect, showing something that has a real impact in the world. And so, you know, papers might need to contain fewer claims and actually focus more on robust proof to make our literature more reliable. And my takeaway from all of this is that the real strength in developing a more robust psychology as a whole, and also environmental psychology, is to combine methods. And, you know, this seems to be, a lot of researchers seem to be taking this idea to heart. There was this paper that came out just recently looking at the number of total articles that are published that mention mixed methodological research across the years, and you see this upward trajectory, right? So starting in 2007, there's been this huge increase in the number of articles that are using mixed methodologies in their work. However, psychology is definitely not the leader in that. When you look at fields in which these journal articles mentioning multiple methods or mixed methods are coming from, nursing seems to be the biggest one, and you know, that's followed by education and family studies, and then anthropology and psychology are kind of, I think psychology was like 1% of articles mention mixed methods. And that's kind of, it's kind of disheartening because I think we really do have the potential of bringing in diverse methodologies. And then I just wanted to quickly note this. So this was a meta-analysis done of communication research articles, which looked at articles that use social media data versus those that use traditional methodologies. And it's pretty amazing that, there's 34 articles were using social media data. But if you look at how many are employing both approaches, so using social media data and also traditional methodologies together, it was just a very, very small slice of overall articles. So I want to get into a couple of examples of what mixed methods environmental psychology might look like. And these are going to be examples from my own work, which are, by no means the standard that we should all aspire to or anything, but it's just, these are just the examples that I know the most about. So the first example that I want to bring up is a paper that I worked on in collaboration with researchers at the University of Chicago and the TKF Foundation. And what was really interesting about this foundation is that they had access to a number of parks in which they installed a bench that was kind of supposed to be like the thinking bench. And under this bench, they had put journals and a pen that people could use to write their thoughts as they were sitting in these urban parks and experiencing nature. And what we wanted to do was look at what the content of these journals were. So what are people actually thinking about and writing about as they're spending time in the parks? And then on top of that, we also had pictures of all of these various parks. So, we wanted to explore whether there was some correspondence between the visual features from these parks and what people were writing about. And what we found in our initial study was that people, as they sit in parks and think about whatever they think about, some of the most common themes that come up are about spirituality, about family, about love. So all of these really nice themes and topics that people really start to think about as they spend time in nature. And what was even more interesting was that there was a correspondence between these journal themes and park features. So we found that parks that had more curves and less straight lines were the ones in which we found more journal entries that talked about these themes of spirituality and love. So we extended this work with online experiments in which we presented people with images in which we had manipulated, the extent of curves, how natural a setting was, and again, asked them to write about what they would think about if they were in a place like that. And again, we found the same kinds of things. So where pictures were rated as most natural and they had more curves and fewer straight edges, we found people again thinking about spirituality and love and families. And from my perspective, there were a couple of really cool things about this study. So for one, we know that spending time in nature, from a whole host of work, we know that spending time in nature has this profoundly restorative effect on people. It makes people happier. It makes you better able to focus and reduce stress and all of these kinds of calming physiological responses. And this study gave a bit of insight into why that might be happening. So because we have these journal entries from the time that people are sitting and experiencing nature, we know that people spontaneously generated these themes of spirituality and love. So perhaps that gives us a bit of insight into what might be causing that restorative effect of nature. Furthermore, because of these experiments that we followed up the text and image analysis study with, we're able to attribute causality to some of these visual features, right? And that attribution of causality has the potential to help park managers or even landscape departments at universities design spaces for people who are wishing to experience nature and experience some of that restorative effects of nature. So that combination of online experiments with the more exploratory text and image analysis study really helped us get to that causal attribution, which is useful in designing interventions. Okay, and the second example that I want to talk about is this naturalistic assessment that we conducted of the Clean India campaign. Now, this was a campaign that was launched in 2014 by the Indian government, a nationwide campaign. It was kind of like the ALS challenge in the US. So people could start to engage in some cleanup activities and then nominate people within their networks on social media platforms to also participate in those types of activities. So we wanted to first assess whether this nationwide campaign in India was effective, and if so, why? What are the means through which it's having its effect? So when we started to do the analysis of tweets pertaining to this Clean India campaign, we saw two pretty distinct clusters of words or topics emerge from our analysis of like 10 million tweets. One appeared to be a topic about people's general awareness of the campaign. So what are the goals of the campaign? How do you actually participate in the campaign? And the second topic that emerged pretty distinctively was a more behavioral topic, where actually people were nominating and requesting their participation in the campaign. So how do I get involved in this? And what we found was that 10 weeks after the start of the campaign, the behavioral topic showed a sustained impact, a sustained increase from baseline, which was before the campaign actually started. So it seemed like, at least over this short 12-week period, that the Clean India campaign was having some sort of positive increase in actual people engaging in stewardship or environmental behaviors. So our next question was why this campaign was effective. And one idea that we were thinking about was that it was really drawing on notions of purity, which are very emphasized within Indian moral frames. So a lot of work by Rick Schrader and others had shown that purity is a really important notion within Indian cultures. And so we wanted to see, because this campaign was drawing on this notion of cleanliness and purity, could those same kinds of impacts be replicated in the lab? So we conducted 3 behavioral experiments, which we pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, I believe it's called. And we found that with Indian participants, the purity-based appeals were more likely to increase green behavior than ecocentric appeals, which are the traditional appeals that you see with let's not cause harm to the environment. But these purity-based appeals, which really focused on cleanliness and keeping our natural resources pure, were the ones that actually increased environmental behavior. And again, this was with Indian participants. So thus far, we've been talking about how environmental psychology might employ multiple paradigms. I want to shift the focus just a bit to talk about how a multi-methodological approach actually needs diverse participants as well, and also how we need to bring in, or why we need to bring in, diverse practitioners. So first of all, with diversity in participants, to me, it's, I love and hate reading examples of these really egregious errors that we have made as scientists. So one of my favorite examples is a study from the 80s, which was actually examining uterine cancer, I believe. But their participants didn't include a single woman. And that was because they said, women have too many hormones. So, that's a pretty explicit example, but, we're not doing so much better within environmental psychology. And that's actually, it's problematic because environmental justice is such a huge concern within our field, and from two distinct perspectives, right? So one is this exposure perspective that overwhelmingly the countries that are at the highest risk of facing the initial ramifications of climate change are tend to consist of high poverty populations. So for example, of the 10 most affected countries up until I think 2014, 9 were countries that were low income or lower middle income group. And you know, issues like the water crisis in Flint or in Houston with the tropical storms, and over again, you see the same pattern reoccurring, that natural disasters hit populations that are already struggling. So there's this huge exposure issue with environmental justice. And of course, there's that access issue. So many of our minority communities and lower income communities don't have the same access to nature. And we see that over and over again when we look at visitations to public lands. So we find that minorities are not making as much use of public lands and don't have access to those natural spaces than majority culture or white populations. So considering this environmental justice issue, it's more critical than ever in environmental psychology to bring in diverse participants. And I also wanted to mention that, you know, this paper that came out in 2010, which was kind of an instant classic in psychology, shows that everything from really basic visual illusions to, of course, the more complex psychological processes is influenced by culture, right? So, you know, things that we consider to be universal kind of are not, or at least we need to recognize to the extent to which they're not. This paper came out in 2016, and it showed a really nice effect that the correspondence between environmental concern and environmental behavior is also a function of culture. So countries that are most individualist actually show a higher correlation between environmental concern and behavior than countries that tend to be low on the individualist scale. And you know, there's all sorts of problems with the individualist collectivist distinction again, but this to me is really interesting because, you know, all sorts of scales that we use within environmental psychology, like the NEP, are founded on the idea that environmental concern is predictive of behavior. So, you know, with various moderators, of course, but imagine a researcher or a researcher that had started to explore the idea of environmental concern and behavior in Ghana or Chile. You know, these countries that show a really small correspondence between concern and behavior. I mean, would we ever have come up with something like the NEP, or what might have been the meaningful measure there? So it just suggests that we need to be more mindful of who the participants are in our research. And in some of our own work, we found that people who live under conditions of scarcity have pretty different motivations to engage in green behavior. We tested 2 different types of framing motivations in green products. So using traditional moral frames that, you know, using environmentally friendly laundry detergent will make the world safer for future generations, versus you'll get more bang for your buck if you get this particular laundry detergent. And we found that the pragmatic frame really was more effective for people under conditions of scarcity. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that there are a number of psychologists who have been working with indigenous populations, like one of my good friends, Bethany Milito, who's over at Cornell University. And indigenous groups have been holding all of this tremendous ecological knowledge that points to new directions for research and new ways of conceptualizing human-nature relationships. So Bethany's work, I urge all of you to look into it, is really cool, is you know, looking at how perceptions of plant agency might have ramifications for how we manage our natural resources. And I'm mindful of the time, so I'm speeding up just a bit so we get to questions, but I do want to touch upon diversity of practitioners as kind of the final dimension of doing multi-methods research. So this is one of the most depressing things I find of our field. Consistently, forestry, conservation, and environmental sciences are one of the least diverse academic fields in the US. And, you know, I'm not sure exactly why this is. I think obviously one reason is that we have a, you know, a dearth of diversity in the participants that we're choosing for these types of studies. It's also a huge issue within the Forest Service, where historically we've had a really hard time engaging with non-white, non-rural populations. So if we're doing this analysis now of the past 20 to 30 years of diversity within the Forest Service, and we found that it's kind of stayed pretty flat through several decades now of non-white versus the proportion of non-white versus white members of our workforce. And you know, this makes sense because historically populations who haven't felt ownership over our national parks and forests, there's that disconnect that it feels like those lands aren't ours, or, you know, recreating on these lands isn't what we do. And of course, that's going to get carried over to our workforce. But it matters, right? So it matters who are the practitioners who are asking these questions, because this has been outlined really elegantly in one of the recent books by Doug Medina and Megan Mang, and they put forward a really compelling argument for, you know, our science is really shaped by the perspective of the scientists. So it matters who's asking, because the questions that are being asked will reflect the biases and perspective of the scientists. You know, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in the IPBES program, which is sponsored by the UN. And it's been really inspiring to be in a group of scientists from all over the world and just trying to understand the perspectives that various people are coming from and the questions they ask as a result of those perspectives. So Ezra, are we doing okay on time, or because I can probably skip the next 2 slides if needed.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. We've got a question in the Q&A so far, and if others have questions, please feel free to post them. And Sonya will get through whatever questions she's got time for. So
I just wanted to end with an example of research that we just kind of wrapped up, I think, in the previous year. And it was based on this research that I had done in my pre-Forest Service days with the Ganges River in India, which is consistently rated one of the most polluted rivers in the world, and also happens to be one of the most sacred rivers, so with millions of people traveling there. And, you know, we had uncovered some relationships between those perceptions of the river as sacred and how polluted people view it as. And I thought it was like such a cool, unique study, but it turns out that the Ganges in India is not so unique. And Hindu populations all across the world, the entire Hindu diaspora, rely on bodies of water for their rituals. And in fact, there's a Ganges right here in the United States in Queens, New York. And because of the geography of this particular bay, it's called Jamaica Bay, many of the artifacts that were being used in rituals and prayers by these Hindu worshippers were getting washed back onto the shore, accounting for this dismay part of this headline. So this research project was just such an educational experience for me, because it was done in partnership with Sadhana, which was an NGO, which is very active in Jamaica Bay, composed of Hindu environmental stewards, the National Park Service, and of course my organization, the US Forest Service. All of the questions that we were asking here were kind of inspired by this conflict, that might be too strong of a word, but this kind of issues that were arising from, you know, the National Park Service, who manages this land, and the people who are worshiping there, and then also, of course, the non-Hindu populations who were trying to recreate there and didn't appreciate statues of Hindu gods coming up on their shores, or coconuts or bananas, all of these types of ritualistic artifacts that were being left there. And so we partnered with all of these organizations, and it was just really amazing to participate in these monthly cleanups that were sponsored by Sadhana. And it helped us meet a lot of the respondents within the community for our qualitative and survey work that we did. And also to explore this journey of how people become environmental stewards, but still bringing in their spirituality and their religious frameworks to inform that environmental stewardship. So I just want to kind of end with a summary. You know, we've outlined this idea of multi-methods research in environmental psychology, which is not just based in using multiple paradigms, but it also draws upon bringing in diverse participants and also bringing in diverse practitioners based both in, you know, demographic characteristics, but also disciplinary backgrounds. And, you know, I acknowledge, and probably I know from my own personal experience, that this is a really difficult path to start on. There is a time-honored preference in psychology that really promotes specialization and kind of a narrowing of focus into a particular area and a particular approach to research. And, you know, our incentives are structured in that kind of a way. But it's seeming that, you know, from Sanders' talk last month, it's seeming that there's more and more of an awareness of these multiple methods are the way to help us create a more robust approach to our field as a whole. So, you know, employing triangulation may actually help us result in a more successful science. And in order to have these place-based solutions to complex problems, we need to bring in complex methodology. So that's all for my slides. I hope we have time for questions. I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences with using this type of approach.
We do. Thanks so much, Sonya. That was really awesome. So I will read out a question that we have just in case everybody's not in front of a computer. We do have a few minutes here. So from Valky Duran, she says, excellent presentation, Sonya. Thank you. And I found myself agreeing and enjoying with many of your ideas. One question, can you say a bit more on how to conduct online web-based studies given the kind of larger context that you've been talking about, especially given the relevance and importance of diverse participants and kind of diversifying our participants? Like, what does that look like?
And you're asking specifically about online studies?
Correct.
Yeah, so, you know, one way obviously that we've been doing that is by using platforms like MTurk or Prolific, which allow you, and actually some people have even started using Qualtrics panels. So they can, those Qualtrics panels are kind of amazing because they allow you to get as granular as you could possibly imagine with the types of participants that you want to recruit. And so we have access to global populations now, or at least populations across the world that are using online platforms. So that's one way that I see it applying to online sources. But the other way is that, you know, initiatives like IPBES or IPCC, which create systems of, or create networks of researchers from across the globe, are really great for doing collaborative research that are not just reliant on online sources. So you can, by collaborating with, you know, I have a colleague on my IPBES chapter from Kazakhstan, which I would never have had access to, you know, that perspective ever before. So forming those types of collaborative networks, I think, has been a really great way for recruiting all sorts of participants.
Awesome. Do you have the Q&A? Are you able to see the Q&A as well?
Oh,
pull it up.
Let me see. Yes. Okay.
Got another kind of more of a comment.
Yeah. So partial answer to why people of color, minorities might not join environmental studies. Many of us have been functioning under the scarcity mind frame. Yes, They're thrilled to have a job, end of story. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and then the mentorship question is huge, right? So if you don't have a model of what diversity in science looks like, or diversity in environmental science looks like, it's hard to emulate.
And I mean, I had a question as well for you, which was, we've got a couple minutes here, but just to give us a sense of kinds of training that you think, especially we've got a lot of graduate students on the call and early career researchers, what kinds of training can people get out there? Should they be getting in order to pursue this kind of triangulation approach, which I think is a really nice way to put it? Is this, I mean, you talked a bit about collaboration, but
Yeah.
are you able to do all these different things? Are you always relying on teams? Which skills are the most important ones from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the collaboration piece is huge for this. So many of the multi-methods research articles that you'll see are not going to have just 2 or 3 authors, right? They're going to be those 15, 16, 17, 18 different authorship. And a lot of journals now are starting to ask for what the individual contribution of each author is. So that, I think that's a great step in the right direction. And then the other thing, that really practical thing I would advise students to do, I wish I had done more of this when I was in grad school, is take classes that are not in your own department. I learned a lot of the automated text analysis when I was in the private sector. I would never have come across that in my psych program in grad school. So, just to try to break these silos of knowledge that we create in our departments and get out. And what I really wish I had done was take an ecology course when I was in grad school, because it's very embarrassing to be in a room with ecologists and not know. So just getting outside of our own departments and taking classes from other places is great. And make use, if you're really interested in the computational approach, make use of all of the massive online courses like Coursera or Kaggle is doing a lot of those nice fundamental introductory courses of, doing GIS analysis or doing a lot of this linguistic analysis.
Great. And I think we've got one more question that got posted actually to the chat box from Karen Mintz, asking about whether leading journals such as JEPS are accepting manuscripts based on these sorts of mixed approaches and triangulation. And so you showed us that graph showing kind of a big uptick in mixed methods research, but have you been seeing this particularly in those leading journals, or do we still have problems of kind of editors and reviewers saying, no, this doesn't really fit what we do at JPSP or, Psych Science or other top journals?
Yeah, I mean, Sanders' talk last month, he's the editor-in-chief of Journal of Environmental Psychology, I believe. That was really informative to me, because what he talked about was bringing in robust, diverse methodologies. And that's what he's looking for, right? And I can only imagine that other EICs feel the same way, is that this reproducibility crisis in the science, if anything, it's made us just a lot more skeptical of the traditional approaches and, a series of experiments that all kind of make a nice statement, but maybe don't have that real world relevance. So actually this crisis has been a gift for us in diversifying our approach. And I think editors feel the same way. I find that I get more pushback when I submit papers that just have experiments, and specifically like online experiments, than when I present a more holistic answer using multiple methodologies for whatever research question.
Great.
People want to see something that's more real world now.
I think that's a really hopeful, optimistic note to end on, kind of following up. Bob Cialdini called many years ago now for social psychology in particular to accept and embrace mixed methods and field experiments in particular. And it's, I agree with you. I think we're seeing a lot more of that, and it's a really positive step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So I want to thank Sonya again for joining us for today, and all of you for calling in. As I said, this whole session will be posted within a couple of days to the Division 34 YouTube channel. And I hope many of you can make next month's call when we'll be talking with Ruben Sussman, who's kind of the behavioral science expert at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. So that's all for us today, and hopefully see you back in a month. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.